Good morning. Thank you for being here for today's genealogy program. Today is April 12th, 2025, and I am Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. Today's program is The Rule of Silence Must Be Observed in the Library. And so I'm using library resources and library records, I'm imagining, to do our genealogy research. I don't have any announcements this morning, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Terri to learn more about libraries and genealogy. Thank you.
So, yes, good morning. We are going to talk about libraries and all the folks that might have worked in them this morning. But we're going to start by looking back hundreds and thousands of years. Originally, knowledge and as well as stories were passed down orally. And as the centuries went by, clay tablets were developed, papyrus scrolls, and the form that we know today is called codex. It's the codex format of books that we use today. There were illuminated texts, and finally, in 1454, the Gutenberg press came along and allowed us to have quote unquote mass produced volumes. Here is a clay tablet, and we have to realize that libraries predate the books that we know today, those that were in the codex form. But there were libraries with clay tablets. I'm not going to pronounce this correctly. The Ashurbanipal Library is the oldest known library, and it was assembled by the Assyrian king in Nineveh between 668 and 631 BC. And they had some 30,000 clay tablets. A papyrus scroll. The library in Alexandria, Egypt, was opened in the 3rd century BC, and they estimated anywhere between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls in their collection at its height. While this is a very, very old one, this is the format that we know today. And it began in the 4th century AD. Illuminated manuscripts were produced in European monasteries, and the idea was to reproduce texts that were already in existence. One book was done by one monk. So production was very, very limited, but they were elaborately illustrated and really, really beautiful volumes. When we were in southern France last year, we actually toured a monastery, and they had what was called a warming room where the monks would sit and copy. The warm was not for the monks, it was to keep the ink warm so that it could be used to do the illuminated text. Otherwise, the room was very, very cold. So the Gutenberg press came along, and it had movable, reusable type. And this was the first time that books then became available for larger numbers of people. Each copy of the book was the same. There were no differences between them. They could produce more copies, and they could produce more titles, and they covered a vast range of subjects. So this required new techniques for organizing these. And that is one of the things that we're going to look at today, how the organization of libraries changed. The press also stimulated literacy and education for the general public. It's hard to say that in the 1400s, the general population was getting much education, but it did make available to a greater number of people, even though they were probably just the very wealthy. Here is a copy of a Gutenberg Bible. And why did libraries come about? Well, first of all, they needed a place to store all of these volumes. And then, how do you organize it? If somebody came in, were they going to be able to find whatever book they were looking for? So the libraries were those first efforts to organize documents. Cataloging as we know it today was not standardized until the late 19th century. And for the most part, initially, they relied on the memory of the librarian. And if you go into a library today, librarians are still extremely knowledgeable about where things are located and how to find them. So we also developed card catalogs so that people like you and me could locate the information. Early libraries, especially, well, worldwide, were private. They were opened by members only organizations. Members would contribute books and they would share them among themselves. They were subject to the private gifts of wealthy individuals. So not everybody had access to the library. People of good wealth would make contributions of volumes. So women and people of color were not necessarily welcome. The Bible was found in all libraries, but books of popular fiction were not. For the most part, especially in the United States, early on, religious texts were the focus of libraries. There was something called chain libraries where books were actually chained to the shelves. And so you could only read it at the desk. You couldn't take it away to your home. And here is a picture of the chain library books. And notice you can't, other than the Bible, you can't read what the book was about from the spine. So the first library in the United States was the Harvard Library. It was begun in 1638 with a donation of 400 volumes from John Harvard, a Puritan minister. Here again, most of the books were religious texts. By 1764, it was the largest library in British America with over 5,000 volumes. But in that same year, there was a fire that destroyed most of the collection. And I found this on Facebook. There were only 144 books were saved because they were checked out at the time. And one of them was returned in 1977. So in the 1700s, we see the rise of non-religious texts. And we see also that more and more people are learning how to read. So private book clubs were established among wealthy men, and these evolved into what were called subscription libraries. And our friend, Mr. Benjamin Franklin, recommended that school libraries were a key element in ideal academy. So, and we will see how he contributed to the library movement. In 1944, the Penn Chapter School in Philadelphia was the first to designate a specific room in their school as a library. So Benjamin Franklin was one of the people that established a subscription library. He had a group of friends, and they called their club the Junto or Junto, and they exchanged books with one another. By 1731, there were 50 members, and they either contributed money or books, and they established the Library Company of Philadelphia, which still exists today. The members paid an initial fee, and then they paid annual dues. And this type of subscription library became very popular, and many, many more followed on Franklin's example. In the early 1800s, the middle class developed, and the movement for universal literacy became more popular. Mandatory schooling was becoming of fashion, and democracy, quote, required educated, informed citizens. So libraries started to spread from big cities into the smaller towns. But in order for a small town to have a library, they needed to have a centralized population. They needed to have economic development, and they needed to have political stability in order to fund a library. So in 1800, the Library of Congress was started. Unfortunately, during the World War of 1812, it was burned. But thanks to Thomas Jefferson and his vast collection, the Library of Congress was rebuilt in 1915, and it did house Jefferson's collection. In 1833, the first tax-supported free public library opened in Peterborough, New Hampshire. And it was rather a grand structure. We'll see in a minute. The New York State enacted legislation to allow school districts to use tax funds to purchase books as early as 1835. And here is that Peterborough Library. So, and we see in the 1850 census, I was able to find 40 people that were listed as librarians. You will note that they were all men at this particular time. It would be another 10 years, and it would actually be another 50 years before women became the prominent librarians, the majority of them. But we see that Virginia, Louisiana, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, they are all establishing libraries. And we do see from newspaper articles that even territories, as well as the states, are setting up laws for the establishment of libraries and the regulations on how they will be governed. We see another one from Ohio, Kansas, the Constitution and bylaws for the Kansas Athenaeum, California, regulations of the Marysville City Library. So in the second half of the 19th century, school libraries and public libraries came along, but they needed regular funding. They couldn't last without that regular funding, and they had to come up with a way to do that, whether it be from private donations, taxes, or other systems. Everyone should have access to the information for their self-betterment. That was the slogan for the library movement. In 1876, the American Library Association was formed, which became a central and important movement and activity to set up some of the standardization that we recognize today in libraries. And here again, it was felt that a free public library was essential to every large city. Libraries at this time were still dependent on the wealth of wealthy individuals. And some of these people had different interests. So, were they more interested in establishing a library, or were they more interested in maintaining their own business? So smaller towns and rural communities, they couldn't afford to build a library. As I said, you had to have a centralized population. In rural areas, was there enough interest in building a library? Did they have the money, whether through donations or taxes, to buy books and also to pay the staff? So here by 1860, we see that we have Emily Poland in Massachusetts and Fanny Earle in Wisconsin. We're seeing more and more libraries established, and we're seeing the introduction of women as librarians. But how do you organize your library? It's really, really interesting. Initially, it was a fixed position, and each book was based on its height. So it's kind of like you see people come into the library today and say, oh, I read the best book. It had a red cover, but I can't remember the name. So you got to look for all the red books. Here's the same type of thing. Books are organized by the height and when it was acquired. So very, very difficult to find. In some cases, books were alphabetized. There was no attention paid to the subject, so maybe they were alphabetized by author, and at least that's a little bit better system. Then general subjects, sciences, arts, history, or any of the other topics. So all of these had some shortfalls until Mr. Melville Dewey came along. And Mr. Dewey was born in 1851 in New York State, and he determined in early life that it was his destiny to reform the education of the masses. He attended Amherst College and graduated in 1874 and went on to get a master's degree in 1877. So all of the things that he founded were still when he was in graduate school. And in 1876, he developed the Dewey Decimal Classification System. It's interesting to note that in order to better the education of the masses, he actually changed the spelling of his name from Melville with the L-E on the end and shortened it to Melville. He did this with many other words as well, making them more look more like they were pronounced. Fortunately or unfortunately, that method did not stick. So 135 countries still use the Dewey Decimal System today. Our Canyon City Library uses the Dewey Decimal System. There is also here in the United States the Library of Congress system. He also, in that same year, founded the Library Bureau, which was a business that sold index cards and filing cabinets. And this is where those famous card catalogs came into being. He established the 3x5 standard dimension for the catalogs. This unit also had an investigative unit, and it was to determine, they wanted to study how did books disappear, um, how how did they manage the loss of books, and how did they manage the circulation system. So he also introduced hanging vertical files. Here is his volume that talks about the classification and subject index for cataloging from 1876. And the original cards that went into the card catalog were hand printed. So he specified and provided a specimen on how these two were to be written, and take great pains to have all writing uniform in size, slant, spacing, and forms. And our famous card catalogs that have pretty much gone by the wayside today. So I mentioned the American Library Association. Initially, it was mostly a male profession, but women did volunteer. Those that were of the higher classes and did not have to work outside of the home would work with children, especially. And it was finally in 1900 that women would finally dominate the profession. And in 1911, Teresa Elmendorf was the first woman president of the ALA. Here is a 1901 convention of ALA members in Wisconsin. And the late 1800s and early 1900s was a huge, we saw a huge influx of immigrants. And in response to that, the ALA recognized that they needed to do something to enhance the lifestyle of these immigrants. So they amassed foreign language collections, and they sponsored English language programs. They had guidebooks for the librarians on how to adapt their collections in order to meet the needs of immigrants. And they have continued to do these kinds of movements as our society has changed through the 20th and 21st century. The library has advanced. Computers have come along. Libraries now have many social aspects to them, not just the reading. And the ALA has been behind all of those movements and activities. So Mr. Dewey continued in his profession, and in 1833, he founded the School of Library Economy. It was the first school where librarians were taught how to be librarians. He also, 10 years later, set up traveling libraries. He would get a book, a batch of books, between 30 and 100, and he would send those to locations where a library did not exist. Unlike or similar to the bookmobile idea, he sent the books to a stationary place. So they might have gone to a post office or a store where someone would volunteer to take care of the books, check out the books, and receive the books back. This system actually started in New York State, where he lived, but it expanded state by state. And here is a picture of Mr. Dewey. He was the director of the New York State Library and held many, many offices in the library world. Here is an 1897 catalog of traveling librarians in Wisconsin. And we see how they're stored in a closet-like form. And we see from the census, this is the 1930 census, and we still had traveling libraries. So we see Mabel Shyrock, and she is living in Maryland, and she is a university traveling librarian. We see Marguerite Hurd, the Free Traveling Library of Oregon State Library, the Idaho Free Traveling Library with Margaret Roberts as our librarian. And this is a 1903 Rocky Mountain News article that traveling library bill is warmly favored. And again, a 1934 article from the Rocky Mountain News that traveling libraries are of great advantage. We also see in books how traveling libraries, Judge Kinney and his fellow Judge Horace Deemer have organized a traveling library system, and they prepared and classified lists of more than 3,000 books, planned cases, and framed rules. So this is one of those cases of dig deeper. These are judges. They're probably not going to be listed anywhere as librarians, but think of the influence they had in their community as far as library work was concerned. And here we have our philanthropist, Andrew Carnegie. He was born in 1835 in Scotland into a family of weavers. By the time he was 12 years old, his family had moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, actually the Allegheny area of Pennsylvania. And he started work as a 12-year-old, as a bobbin boy, changing spools of thread in a cotton mill. His father also worked in the cotton mill, but quit to go back to his weaving trade. The following year, 1849, he became a telegraph messenger boy. And it was through the work that, as a messenger boy, he memorized the routes, he memorized the names of important people that were receiving telegrams. And he eventually went on to work in railroads so that he invested and broadened his scope and became a multi-millionaire. He recognized, thanks to the generosity of a local man in Pittsburgh that allowed working boys to come into his private library. This gentleman had a library of approximately 400 volumes, and Andrew Carnegie was one of the teens that went to that library on Saturdays to work and study. He recognized how much this had influenced his life and how it had bettered his life. And so later in life, this is where he decided his philanthropy should go. When it came to applying for a Carnegie Library, all applications had to be approved by his personal secretary, Mr. Bertram. Carnegie believed that libraries were palaces for the people and the treasures of the world which books contain. And here is a picture of Mr. Carnegie. So from 1883 to 1929, Carnegie awarded grants to various communities to construct libraries. Each community had to commit to what is called the Carnegie Formula. They had to demonstrate a need for a public library. The community had to provide the land, and they were expected to pay for the operating costs, and the library had to be free for the population. Essentially, the grants paid for the construction of the building only. By 1919, half of all U.S. libraries were built by Carnegie grants. And here is our Carnegie Library. In total, 600 public libraries had been built by Carnegie in 1886. Worldwide, by that 1929, 2,509 were built, 1,795 in the United States. It's important to note also that he built libraries specifically for African American patrons in the South because of segregation. This was the need. And the last grant was issued in 1919. So how did we in Canyon City get our Carnegie Library? Our free reading room is an institution to which Canyon City can point with pride and every day. It is being improved and it is useful and its usefulness enlarged. It now contains over 156 volumes, which are used as circulating library, for which is charged only 10 cents per week for the privilege of reading the books at home. There are over 75 papers of all kinds on file, including the dailies, weeklies, and monthly periodicals. On Monday evening last, pursuant to an announcement, a meeting was held at the reading room to further discuss the formation of a corporate body for the purpose of sustaining a free reading room in this city. The measure was thoroughly debated, and it was agreed to incorporate the Canyon City Reading Room Association with a capital stock of $3,000 divided into 300 shares of $10 each. The directors for the ensuing year are Mrs. M.M. Sheets, Maria Sheets, Mrs. M.M. Engelman, Mr. W.R. Fowler, and others. So you see how by reading newspaper articles, those people that are not directly involved as librarians, but are significant developers and contributors to libraries. So we have the first Ladies Library Association with Mrs. Sheets, Harding, Campbell, and Reynolds. They collected books by going door to door, asking people for donations. And they were so successful that they raised money to buy a building. And the initial one was at 505 Main Street. But they soon realized that they needed more. And in 1909, Mrs. Ragsdale started correspondence, or 1901, excuse me, Mrs. Ragsdale started correspondence with Mr. Carnegie. In January of 1902, they purchased lots from the old Presbyterian Church on Macon and Fifth, and $3,500 was used to purchase the land. On the right, you will see that a Carnegie Library has been awarded to the city of Canyon City, $10,000 for the construction. Unfortunately, that was not enough. So in 1902, there was additional correspondence, and a further $3,000 was donated. But they showed that they had the land, that they were willing to pay for the books that would go into the library, and they would be willing to pay the staff, the Carnegie formula. And in January of 1903, the new library was dedicated. It's interesting. The Canyon Ladies Library Association had regulations. Only one book can be drawn at a time by each member. Now, this was before the library opened, the Carnegie. Books belonging to the library must be not be loaned or exchanged. Books must not be retained more than 2 weeks. Detention beyond that time subjects the holder to a fine of 5 cents a day until returned. Persons drawing books will be required to make good any damage or loss. Library tickets for 1 year can be obtained of the librarian for $2. Persons not holding tickets may draw books by paying 5 cents a week or a fraction of a week. Library tickets must always be presented when a book is drawn. Non-residents will be obliged to deposit $1 before drawing a book. So some of those rules even apply today. And we see here in Canyon City that Ms. Woods is our first Canyon City, the Carnegie Library. She is not the first librarian. The Ladies Library Association did have librarians pretty much on an annual basis. And the museum here has a chronology of the formation of the Library Association, the construction of the library, as well as the personnel for the libraries. Bookmobiles. The first bookmobile was a horse-drawn wagon. And I thought it was interesting in the article that rather than naming the people, they named the horses. Dandy and Black Beauty were the horses for the wagon. And Mr. Joshua Thomas was the driver. This allowed libraries to connect with the people. The librarian for the first bookmobile was Mary Titcomb, and she had apprenticed at a library in Concord, Massachusetts, and she relocated to Washington County, Maryland, and this is where she started the actual bookmobile program. And we see in various censuses Mary as the librarian, and we see Joshua as the deliverer. They, like Mr. Dewey's form, they sent boxes of books um, on the library wagon to small towns. And by 1904, the boxes each contained approximately 30 volumes, and they were sent to deposit stations. By 1912, we have the first motorized book wagon. But here is the first. And rather than going to a stationary place, we see where it is mobile. The dots represent stationary locations. The red lines represent the routes, the various routes that bookmobiles eventually covered as early as 1910. One of the important things about bookmobiles was that there was still a lot of segregation throughout the country. And these bookmobiles brought library collections to segregated communities in the South, as well as to the Native American reservations. The bookmobiles suffered during the Depression and during World War II because many of the men were being called overseas and the lack of money to support these programs. But they were reinvigorated in 1956 by the Library Services Act. And while we don't see very many bookmobiles today, we do have the capability for interlibrary loan so that you can get books from other libraries. Here is one of the motorized. And during the Roosevelt administration, under the Works Progress administration, we have pack horse librarians. These were men and women who traveled rural eastern Kentucky mountains to provide books. In 1913, it was Mary Stafford who solicited money to take the books to the people on horseback. And she projected that the program would only last 1 year. It lasted longer than that. Berea College, which is also in Kentucky, rural Kentucky, sent horse-drawn book wagons into the mountains. But these men and women went to drastic lengths to bring books to people. So it required the help of local people. The libraries they took books to a place, a facility, whether it be something like a post office here again, or a rural community center. You have to realize that in Kentucky, in these hills, it was an isolated population. So they didn't trust outsiders. So the first thing that the libraries had to do, the librarians had to do, was to gain the trust of the people. So librarians at the home, city, town would give books to the carriers. They would ride out at least twice a month, and each route covered 100 to 120 miles a week on horseback. The riders had to use their own horses or mules, and they earned $28 a month. And we see some of the terrain that they had to navigate. Many of the books and magazines, especially, were donations, and they were collected from across the country. The librarians would preserve and repair any books. So if a book if the spine was broken, they would make every effort to repair the book. When the books became too worn, they would paste stories from those books into loose leaf binders. They repurposed old Christmas cards as bookmarks. And here again, because of trust in the local area and realizing the economic situation in the Depression years, they provided things that people would be interested in, women especially. Recipes were circulated, and quilt patterns were provided in scrapbooks. And here is a delivery to a rural cabin. At first, many of the people did not even know how to read. So carriers read Bible passages to their potential customers. They were Their customers were not used to the materials that were coming, those popular magazines, the popular fictional stories. So here again, it was a total effort to gain trust. 30 libraries in Kentucky served 100,000 people. They also served schools and those community centers. About 200 people were employed, and the program ended in 1943. So it did last significantly longer than the 1 year anticipated. And finally, bookmobiles took over in 1946 to serve the population. And we see here a WPA pack horse librarian, and it happens to be a man, Mr. George Gross. I mentioned that segregation was still in effect. Libraries were segregated, just like many of the public institutions at the time. In 1905, Louisville, Kentucky was the first free public library for African American readers. It was staffed entirely and operated entirely by African Americans. And the Reverend Thomas F. Blue was the first librarian. Access to libraries for Blacks was scattered, and it was slow. Major cities, of course, were the first. Smaller cities and towns were significantly later. Louisville Western Branch Library began in 3 rented rooms in a private residence, and they had applied for a Carnegie building, and they had to follow that Carnegie formula. And by 1908, they had a Carnegie building. In Louisville, in 1914, there was a second Carnegie branch for African Americans in Eastern Louisville. And this was all thanks to Reverend Blue. And we see here the Louisville, Kentucky Free Public Library, colored branch. That is Reverend Blue with his staff. And a brief biography of him in the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. They did also have libraries in schools. In 1903, Memphis, 1904, Galveston. And these were school libraries for African Americans. As we've just seen in 1905, Lexington, Kentucky opened the first, followed by Jacksonville, Florida. Other libraries did provide some minimal service to Black communities. As I mentioned earlier, bookmobiles was one of the best ways to get out into the African American community and to bring books to them. Some libraries also closed, perhaps on a Saturday or a single day of the week. They were closed to white patrons and allowed the African American patrons in. So Carnegie, along with the WPA, worked to provide library services for these populations. So where do we find some of these records? We can find librarians listed in census records as well as city directories. It is the newspapers that give us a broader story of libraries, and perhaps those people that were not specifically librarians, but contributors to the library movement. There are U.S. craftsperson files, state and town histories, family histories, and genealogies. And the Bulletin of the American Library Association and the American Library Association membership rosters are available on Google Books. So we'll take a look at some of these very quickly. From as early as 1868, a city directory where Mr. Guild is a librarian at Brown University. So here again, at this early point in time, it's universities that are going to have some of these larger libraries. The Galveston Public Library in 1888, reestablished in 1882, under the direction and supervision of the Galveston Lyceum, 6,000 volumes, and Mrs. Mary C. Felton is our librarian. Louise Eldridge in Salt Lake City. Mrs. Baron Shirley is our librarian in New Hampshire. And we have family histories. In December of 1849, a new system was inaugurated in the management of everyday affairs of the institution by so-and-so. Mr. McElroy remained librarian until 1855 when he was succeeded by, and we see all these other people that acted as librarians or directors. Whoops. Churches. Churches also established librarians or libraries and had librarians. So don't overlook that potential as well. Here's a history. It was published in 1873, but it starts in 1792. At the instance of James Logan, the son, and the only surviving trustee, the property was vested in the Library Company of Philadelphia, founded by Mr. Franklin. The librarians from 1760 to 1792 were, and you see a list long before individual names are listed in the census. The Craftsman Files, librarian and photograph archivists at Yale in an art gallery. So it's important to note that libraries are not just your public libraries. There are the university libraries and there are specialized libraries. Here is a librarian for the Missouri Historical Society. We get the history of not only people. Miss Lillian Stringham was appointed librarian of the new library, but we get the history of the Carnegie Library in this particular community. Family genealogies. Mr. Edward Claudius Herrick, he was the librarian of Yale for 15 years. The bulletin from the American Library Association. These are librarians who have passed away in a known period of time, at least maybe by 1907. And their membership roles as well. So with the idea of digging deeper, some libraries also have book binderies. So it's possible that someone might have worked in one of those and would not be listed as a librarian, but was still working in a library. Today, we have audiovisual programs, computer technology, interlibrary loan, various social programs, and community involvement in libraries. So how was a person working in the library? Books, when they come in, new books have to be cataloged. Is there someone that is a cataloger for a library? And we've seen public libraries and school libraries. There are libraries in museums as well, in art museums, various kinds of museums. There are music libraries. There are industrial libraries. So with the idea of digging deeper into a potential librarian in the family, think about these other aspects where you might find your family member. I'll turn it over to Jess.
Thank you, Terry. That was so good, so interesting. Hearing about our own town's history of libraries and the reading room and the early Carnegie efforts, it's got my curiosity piqued. I might have to dig into this a little bit more. But so impressive, all the effort that people have put in and the building of trust and getting out to the rural communities. Very interesting. So thank you. So thank you for being here today. We hope to see you next time. As you see, it says they also served. That'll be Saturday, May 10th, 9 a.m. And this will be the same format. So just sign up on the museum's website and to get your Zoom link to join us here. Thank you.